The Littlest Suffering Souls is a book about three children. It's about three children who suffered greatly, died young, and brought many people to the faith. I know all three families, and that's how I came to write this book. Is that I wrote a series of columns about these kids. Brendan Kelly, who died at the age of 14, a Down syndrome boy who suffered with leukemia throughout his life, his family lived 2 miles that way. Margaret Leo, little girl who died also at 14 a few years ago. She died from complications of spina bifida. Her father's Leonard Leo, who's the head of the Federalist Society, on the board of the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast with me back in the day. And he's the guy who's probably most responsible for Gorsuch and Kavanaugh.
Right.
So I knew Margaret. And then the third was this little girl from Paris named Audrey Stevenson. And I have worked with her parents. They live in Paris. I've worked with her parents on international pro-life issues for 20 years. So it's like I just knew all these amazing stories, and they're all the same story. When Audrey Stevenson was when she was in the sterile room during her bone marrow transplant, which is a very unpleasant experience, she could see her parents through this little window, but they could hear her singing songs to Mary while she was getting her bone marrow transplant.
Wow.
When Brendan Kelly was getting his bone marrow transplant, he was offering his suffering for Bella Santorum, who's a neighbor nearby.
Yeah.
And
Rick Santorum's daughter?
Santorum's daughter.
Yeah.
And to this day, the Santorums credit Brendan's prayers with the fact that she lived and still lives.
Wow.
So it's just these amazing stories. And Margaret Leo, to this day, her picture is on the desk of Clarence Thomas in a frame made out of popsicle sticks that she made.
Wow.
And there have been genuine miracles since her passing that I believe to be true and that I put in the book. So they're just amazing stories. So I wrote some columns about these kids, the Catholic thing, and the response was overwhelming. It was hundreds of requests for their prayer cards, from all over the world. And I started getting similar stories from all over the world. So it was like there's something really important going on. And so I was with the guys at Tan Books, and they wanted me to write a book about contraceptive politics. And I said, you know what, I'd like to really write this book. And I explained it to these two editors, and they said, wait 1 second. And they left the room, and they came back with everybody in the company. And they said, tell that story again.
Awesome.
And they basically bought it on the spot.
Good.
So it's a really important stories for people to know in this day and age.
What's the common denominator on that? I'm curious, from these three or from all over the world. Is this a piety that they receive from their parents, or is it infused in some miraculous or different way?
Well, both.
Okay.
Audrey Stevenson's story, in some ways, is the most remarkable because she came from a largely unchurched family, and she brought the faith into the family.
Wow.
It's like both Jerome, who is my daughter Gigi's godfather, and Lily Ann, who comes from an old Catholic family in Chicago, but they had fallen away from the practice of the faith, and Jerome wasn't even going to church at all.
Okay.
And Lily Ann was trying to get the family, involved, but at the age of 3, in this unchurched family, one day Lily Ann found that 3-year-old Audrey had decorated the house, every room, with a crudely drawn crucifix.
Wow. Yeah. So that's a supernatural infused knowledge of piety.
She was doing so many. One day, she was 4 years old, being walked home from school with her mother, and she was limping. And Lillian says, "Why are you limping?" And she tried to hide it, but Lillian discovered that she had put pencils in her shoe. "Why did you put pencils in your shoe?" She said, "Well, it's easier to carry them that way." And Lillian said, "Now, why did you put them?" She said, she said this French word, "Je résiste," I resist. She was teaching herself mortification. And nobody taught her that. Yeah. Nobody.
Amazing.
And so they eventually went to their local parish priest and laid out all these amazing things that were going on. What should we do? And you know what he said? Follow her.
Yeah.
And they did. And then 2 or 3 years later, she came down with leukemia. And it's wonderful stories in the book. They were in the hospital. She'd just been diagnosed. And Lillian said, we're going to get through this. We're going to listen to whatever the doctor says, and whatever he does, we're going to do, and everything's going to be fine. And at that point, 7-year-old Audrey said, Mommy, we're going to do what Jesus said. We're going to live like the birds in the trees, day by day.
Yeah. Beautiful.
7-year-old girl said that. Yeah. And this is how she lived, and prayer groups sprung up all over France for her, and men who hadn't said the rosary in 25 years were saying the rosary with their families. And it was just and her prayer card went all over the world. It was just phenomenal what happened.
Yeah.
So yeah, and so you look at Margaret Leo, she was raised in a faithful Catholic family, but she turbocharged her family's faith. And to this day, there are people at the cathedral in Arlington who remember her prayer after communion, where she would say out loud, "Thank you, Jesus, for coming to me in communion today."
Wow.
Quite simple, but people at the cathedral say that to this day because of her.
Nice.
And then Brendan, Down syndrome boy who, came from a faithful Catholic family, who he had this remarkable gift for bringing people out of their shell. He recognized suffering in others, and he would just become a pest and just, bring people out of themselves. And one girl converted because of him. Probably others did too. Just amazing stories of these 3 children. So yes, 2 of them born in faithful Catholic families, but then turned it into something marvelous. Mm-hmm. And one girl born in an unchurched family and introduced the faith there. So, but the thing about it is all of these kids were, I don't want to run down or say anything critical about this girl Santos, who, in Boston, who has been in a coma for 20 years, and people think that there's miraculous things happening around her. She's not sentient, These children knew exactly what was happening to them. They knew that they were sick. They knew that they were probably dying. Right. They were suffering greatly, and they nonetheless turned it into gold.
Yeah. And we worry about these problems with ex-Cardinal McCarrick and all these scandals, and it seems that in every age, there's the magisterium of the church, the Pope and the bishops, but there's this, I'm going to use the word charismatic. There is this charismatic, mystical magisterium that bubbles up from children like these, who are inspiring devotion to the Eucharist and gratitude after receiving communion. Right. I'm thinking of the Catherine of Siena's and the Joan of Arc's and the Martin de Poors, and the people who aren't wearing scarlet, and visiting the Vatican 4 times a year. Yeah, these people have been able to bring about faith, renewal, devotion to the Eucharist, devotion to Our Lady, and maybe that's what we'll be seeing, hopefully in the decades to come, are beautiful holy families, stunning children with a deep life of mental prayer and love for Our Lady and the Eucharist. And, we don't necessarily have to have it come from a bishop, is what I'm saying. Is that we can we can take our eyes off of this level on earth, where we have our bishops and our, our priests and cardinals, and they're all there for a purpose and part of God's plan. But we can always look up and see these saints and these angels and these little ones who have gone before us, and find our strength and our courage in these little saints, right? Is there any movement towards a beatification for these young people? Or you mentioned prayer cards. How far does this go?
The cause for Audrey's beatification actually started in Paris some years ago, but it became stalled, and here's the reason. Jerome and Lillian, who were no longer involved in Regnum Christi, were the first Regnum Christi couple in France.
I see.
And so that redounded negatively to the advancement of Audrey's cause.
I see.
So the Archbishop of Paris has not assigned, what's the word for the person who quarterbacks that?
I don't know.
Yeah, neither do I.
Yeah.
I have known the name, but I don't know
Canonical
it at the second.
cheerleader, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So it stalled a little bit.
Okay.
And one of the reasons that I wrote the book, and I did a extensive interviewing on tape with the moms and dads and brothers and sisters, is precisely to give that
Mm-hmm.
to whatever process that may be. So, Margaret Leo, I'll tell you a Margaret Leo miracle story. Margaret Leo is just sitting, this little girl slumped in a wheelchair, always in the wheelchair her whole life, big smile across her face, the happy, joyful girl, and there's a man here in town named Ed Whalen.
Yeah.
And Ed Whalen is you remember Ed from the CIC?
Sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
Very influential guy.
Yes.
He's the head of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He's worked in the White House, on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and high up in the Justice Department. Very influential guy. So one day, right before she died, Ed's father met her at a softball game, talked to her for a little while, and when he walked away, he said, I just met a living saint. Okay? Shortly thereafter, Margaret dies. Shortly after that, Ed Whalen's father has a cerebral hemorrhage and is going to die.
Wow.
And the Whalens asked the Leos, old friends of theirs, to pray for Margaret's intercession. And within a month, everything was gone.
Wow. I believe
everything was gone.
Yeah.
So it's like, he met her on a softball field, and she saved his life.
Yeah.
From beyond.
Yeah.
So that story is, so these.
So is that moving forward? I mean, that's pretty. It's a type miracle. I mean, is that enough to move forward for a beatification or a venerable?
It's a very interesting question. I think that the Leos are reticent themselves to take the idea to the bishop. So maybe they're waiting for somebody else, and maybe I should be the one that takes these stories to the bishop. We have a new bishop, Burbage. He's been here for a couple of years. Good, solid man. Good, solid man. Good, solid man. So sitting here talking to you, I mean, maybe I am supposed to take it to him.
Yeah.
Somebody's supposed to take it to him.
Yeah,
why not me?
You're the initial hagiographer on this.
Yeah, that's
you
right.
wrote the first accounts.
Yeah, that's right. So maybe I will.